And we are live. It is another great day in Cribl TV. I'm so glad to have the fabulous Jackie McGuire and the way smarter than I am, Jim Apger, here today. We're going to talk about APIs. Great title if you're an API and you know it. So, Jackie, tell me a story. What's going on?
Well, APIs are kind of exploding in volume because it's the most common way for applications to talk to each other in the internet. And unfortunately, we don't always build APIs as the security mind. It's more functional than performative sometimes. So we're going to talk about how API use is expanding, what the great uses of API for security are, what some of the kind of vulnerabilities associated with APIs that we need to be concerned with are. And then Jim, as you said, who is way smarter than we are, is going to give us some ideas about what kinds of API logs we should be looking at and how we should be using them.
That sounds really great. So, let's go through a little bit of a roll call. So, we are all in the great southern half of the world. Jim's in Dallas. So, Jim, tell us a little about yourself.
Hi there. Jim Apger, based out of Dallas. As Ed says, I've been around the space for a long time. I'm super excited to be on this podcast because this live stream, this does really well, and we get great feedback from the field. So this is my first time here, and I'm excited to maybe have a little bit of a riz from the two of you rub off on me because Lord knows I could use some. But one of the longstanding jokes, maybe not a joke, but one of the sayings throughout my career has always been, like, you never forget your first API, and many of us have written our first APIs. And when you think about how that happens, it's to satisfy a need. And oftentimes it's proof of concepts in products. My first API was around a vendor product where I wanted to expose that vendor behind the scenes SQL database and create a web app to use that. So I built an API, and as part of that POC, it was reckless and there was no security involved in that. And I can say the same thing 1,000 times over for a lot of the work that I did in the SCADA environment. We were getting stuff done, and we know how this stuff works. And now, 20 years later, APIs, are the backbone of the digital economy. So it's super excited to kind of talk about where we are today and kind of align some of that around what we see with what we're doing on a daily basis here at Cribl. So good stuff.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. I think you're right. It is the backbone of everything. Unfortunately, as Jackie mentioned, the security of our APIs can be a little bit questionable sometimes. I would like to throw in a plug for please make your APIs usable, but sometimes that's just too much to ask. So, Jackie, tell us about yourself. Let's brag on yourself.
I think you're next.
Oh, come on. I just talked too much.
No, I get to go last. I did us in alphabetical order by last name. So.
Oh, there you go. You're so organized. There you go. Yeah. So I've worked in the space for quite some time, large industry. I was one of Cribl's first customers way back in 2018, and it's been really amazing watching how thanks to tools like Cribl, that with your observability and security data, you can actually solve some problems and not have to kill yourself. I think you want to get down to it, ease of use, being able to get things done is super important. And I'm just a big advocate for your talking about your strategy. Why are you doing what you're doing before you start talking about how? And so it's fun to be here, and thank you. Now your turn, Jackie. Brag on yourself. Come on.
All right. Yeah, I am also a big fan of strategic thinking before practical application. So I started my career in finance, spent about 15 years between Fidelity and SVB, and have started a few companies, worked for a few companies, ended up making my way into data science, mostly because I wanted to learn how to write Python and already had an economics and finance degree and knew statistics. So happy to take a job at a SIM writing anomaly detection and user and entity behavior analytics, which is how I ended up in security. So I'm kind of a big picture person. I like to think about data science and AI and how that's going to interact with the world and how we're going to manage the exploding volumes of data that we have, some of which is driven by this API problem that we're about to talk about. So we can probably jump into it. So this statistic is crazy, right? So in 2020, the average developer was using 11 APIs. In 2023, that had increased by 54% to 17 APIs. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, 11 to 17, if you think about data volume, that's an insane increase. And as we already mentioned, none of these are particularly typically built for security purposes. They're built for practical applications. So the amount of APIs we're using is increasing dramatically, and the amount of logging that needs to be done in conjunction with those APIs is also dramatically increasing. So would you say that the number of APIs that our average customer is using is increasing as far as you've seen?
Dramatically.
Yep. I'm going to quick comment on this as well. As customers are driving to close visibility gaps, closing those gaps in cloud and in OT is tough, right? So they're leaning on vendor solutions to close those gaps for them, and they provide a ton of value. And what ends up happening is they have another console there, but there's data embedded in that SaaS application somewhere, right? So, they're not just using them internally; they're also in charge of having to script the exporting of that data from APIs from external vendor solutions, right? So it's much bigger than just internal.
And Jim, one thing I wanted to ask you about especially was, everyone wants to get API data, but I think from a skill set perspective, a lot of security and ops teams struggle with it, and then they need better tools to pull data from APIs. And also the time it takes to write scripts and write code, just from scratch. It's just too much time to ask for teams that are already strapped.
Yeah, Ed, you came from the enterprise space, right? So you live this firsthand within the enterprise. So again, we see it just by touching our Cribl customers, and as we interact with these customers, you hear it loud and clear. And I think all three of you heard this as well. We just had our company CKO, which was amazing, a couple of weeks back, and specifically one of the 4 customers called out the fact that it's scripting, and now that we've got GraphQL out there as a query language around APIs, it's even that much tougher on top of pagination and breaking and everything else. So you've got individuals that will create those scripts and they'll run just fine, and that person kind of moves on, and now you're stuck with these legacy scripts that are all out there being run on an automated basis. So who knows what they're doing, but absolutely, just like we need to centralize logging around APIs, we absolutely need to figure out how to modernize that approach towards unifying the experience for retrieving data from that API. Yep.
And Jim brought up a great point too. The explosion of APIs. Everyone's using a SaaS application, and so you need to get APIs to get that data to get your systems, because every SaaS application becomes a point of entry for your data, point of entry into your potential systems, and so it's a must. You've got to be able to get that data from your SaaS applications.
Yeah, think about it. ServiceNow, the OT space, the cloud space, asset, identity, like all that stuff matters, right? So building live CMDBs and live identity databases, again, a huge portion of that is going to be driven by API.
Hey, Jackie, this is for you. So how do you give your honest feeling, but how do you feel about having to have a special license to get audit logs from your SaaS application?
Yeah, I think we need a developer's bill of rights, right? And a troubleshooter's bill of rights. That if I'm paying you to use your application, it probably should come along with all of the things that I need to also be able to detect whether that application has been used as an entry point into my systems. And I think this statistic, the size of the problem that we're dealing with is not inconsequential, right? $1 trillion by 2030 is an insane amount of money to be moving through APIs. And if you think about, executives at publicly traded companies being personally liable for things that happen from a security perspective now, I think the SolarWinds prosecution kind of scared the crap out of everybody. If you can't get the data that you need to detect the things that you're going to be prosecuted for, it doesn't really seem like it's very fair, does it?
Yeah, it's crazy town. And so I think that's why it's just so important to get people thinking about their APIs. What are they doing to secure it? What are they doing to use that in their general security and observability practices?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of adversaries start out as engineers on the good side, right? And so if there are places in your enterprise where you think, oh, we don't need to monitor these APIs because the chances of being exploited are really low, well, that's only going to be the case for a couple quarters until somebody decides to go from the light side to the dark side and knows for a fact that many of the organizations they're working with haven't been monitoring specific aspects of APIs, and that's where it starts to get really dangerous. Let's get into types of API logging, since we're talking about what you should be paying attention to. So we've got a handful that I thought might be good to talk about. Just regular API logs. So these are the kind of general logs. But then we get into different types of API logs, right? So when we're discussing this, preparing for this live stream, verbose API logs were discussed, and these things are great because they contain a ton of information, but they're also pretty large, right? So I think, the necessity to collect these, what's your experience with verbose API logs? When is it essential to collect these, and what kinds of applications are we using these for?
Different audiences, right? For each of these different log types that we're going to talk about, many of these need to go to multiple locations. But as we look at these enterprise applications that are full of microservices, something has to glue those together, right? It's typically like APM, right? So just understanding on a day-to-day basis what services are supposed to be talking to what services. Hopefully you've got an API gateway front-ending everything, but on the inside we have API gateways monitoring, and then how do we enforce like zero trust beyond those? If that doesn't exist today, then the best thing we have is potentially like full trace API logs to help glue all that stuff together. And again, I think we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, but being able to just run simple baseline concepts around all of these traces is extremely important, so that out of nowhere, right, when we have one slip up, and this happens again and again, when we have one authenticated or compromised API on the inside that can talk to anything else on the inside, right? It's a big, huge problem, right? So these trace logs are really important just to understand who's talking to what. Tons of detail.
Your basic logs are your table stakes. You got to catch that. And as Jim mentioned, your verbose logs are a real struggle because you need it for troubleshooting, but you also need it for forensics. You need it to, IR. And that's why, but teams struggle with the amount of data. Some of the full trace logs can be just incredible. And so that's where it comes, you have to think differently about how you're doing it, and especially if you can park that data in object storage and not necessarily put it into your SIM. But you have to be careful making some decisions there.
They're ephemeral, right? So once they're gone, right? So we need those to go somewhere long term. So it's a big one.
Yeah.
Good job, Jackie.
And again, the value is somewhat subjective, in that they can go from being bulky and very low value to bulky and very high value with one incident. Right. Another area where we see a lot of value in API logging is debug logs. So for things like CI and CD. And I'm going to just go ahead and throw the last one up here as well. So then we also have your API operations logs. So these also have different audiences, right? And these are kind of more custom built for specific purposes than the full trace logs. But what do you think the challenges are with handling these kinds of API logs?
I think you've got to monetize them, first, right? So one of my favorite examples is a large retailer here in Texas has struggled during holiday seasons with just keeping the monitoring up of this gigantic website, during these periods of change control, like absolute code freezes. So as they're trying to watch what's happening within the website, make strategic decisions around, couponing and sales and everything else, and your application monitoring software, can't keep up. It's a huge deal, right? So again, it's about money when we talk about performance.
We had something very similar. We ended up having to use a third-party SaaS platform to do API monitoring because it was the only way that we needed ease of use, because that was a big issue, but also that instantaneous scale that when Black Friday rolls around, that we know that it's going to be able to handle it. So of course we'd work with them, but it's and also it's a highly technical challenge. You have to put a lot of time into figure out what are the right metrics and making them meaningful.
Yeah, and continuing to demonstrate why they're important to continue to collect, even if they haven't been necessary for a few quarters, right? That's always the justifying the existence of logs that haven't been important. Just it can be difficult because you're trying to explain the consequence of not having them in an emergency, and that's not always easy for people to conceptualize.
And when they're flowing in, times are good. That's one thing. But again, when things start to fall down, able to forecast. A looming issue is the other half of that story.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about some ways that we can use APIs as a security tool. So I'm actually just going to throw these. I did all this fancy animation because I was trying to flex my slide skills, but it's probably easier to just have them all up at once for people who like to digest it all at once. So there's a handful of different ways that we talk about using APIs as a security tool. And when used correctly, they can really help augment and empower a security organization to get the data that they need to really protect a modern enterprise. So some of the things that we look at are things like identifying gaps in applications. So as we were talking about, a lot of times enterprises have their own custom-built microservices and applications that they use internally, not always built to be the most secure things in the world as much as just to get a job done for a specific project quickly. So APIs can be a great way to kind of monitor those applications and look for gaps there. Obviously, log management for the cloud. The cloud is great in the sense that you can use somebody else's computer and, to Ed's point, get that kind of instant scale that you're looking for. But there's also a lot of things to monitor in the cloud. There's all these different apps and services and things like that that enable cloud things to talk to each other, each of which produces a pretty steady stream of noisy logs that have to be monitored. Data privacy and retention. This is one that I think over the next couple years, we've already started to see some pretty crazy legislation around data privacy. And I think, enterprises are going to start to be asked to retain more data and retain it for longer. So these crazy verbose logs that we're talking about with full traces that are so bulky and expensive to store long term, you may not have a choice if you're a highly regulated or publicly traded business going forward, because auditors and regulators are definitely looking at that. And then the last one I think is probably one of the most compelling, which is that APIs can be a phenomenal tool for getting access to threat intelligence and information sharing. So there's tons of amazing databases out there. Like we use MaxMind for geo-IP location. There's all kinds of different telemetry and intelligence and enrichment databases that are available for free that you can access via API, which can really be a powerful tool for your security organization. I just talked for like 5 minutes straight. So
And it was awesome.
I'm going to stop. If anybody has anything to add.
Well, there's so many behind the scenes services too. When we talk about like e-commerce, I haven't looked over the last year, but historically the number has been, if you choose to do business with the internet, roughly 6% of your revenue derived from these e-commerce sites is given up to fraud. So there's a million controls behind the scenes in terms of, fraud nets, known organizations, known shipping addresses, known mules, just a zillion services that get tied in behind the scenes as these folks struggle to deliver a service while walking the line around anti-fraud.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and you mentioned creating the glue, because you have all these tools in your enterprise. So not only your customer facing applications, but everything else. APIs are crucial to be able to tie that together and to give you that visibility. And so it's just it is a challenge. It takes some very careful thought, and I think this is one of the places where it's easy to have gaps, because you may not even know there's a SaaS service there. And so from a governance perspective, this creates just a lot of heartburn for security teams, understanding, what's the SaaS service that someone would use their corporate credit card to open up.
Yeah, I've kind of railed against that in the past, that I really feel like we do just a terrible job controlling data creation around the enterprise, and everything from, paying for services as a one-off and not following any prescribed procedure for documenting those. And a lot of times people, it's very seldom are people doing these things with bad intent, as much as just a lack of awareness of the various layers of ripple effect that can happen when you have something like this that's unsecured. So actually, it's a great segue into our next discussion, which is that one of the things that we're starting to see is APIs are really increasingly the subject of a lot of different types of attacks. And the first one is this advanced injection attack. So as we have layer upon layer of API services on top of each other, to Jim's point, when you get into an enterprise through one layer of API, this now gives you the ability to do kind of advanced, whether it be SQL or XML, these kind of attacks that attack microservices that are 3 or 4 layers deep within an organization. And a lot of times the attitude is, well, we've got, security on the cloud, and we've got basic zero trust, and we've got these things in place, so it's fine to not be as strict with some of these things that are several layers deep. But we're actually seeing significantly more of these types of attacks happening. The other
I thought we were done. Before you got point, Jackie, I thought we were done with SQL injection attacks, right? And now we've got GraphQL, is alive and well, and that's maybe the new standard going forward. And it's the same damn thing in SQL injection attacks all over again, embedded within that language. And you know this probably better than I do. It's the whole prompt injection scenario, which is exactly SQL or SQL injection, but it's very specific to AI and the 7 or 8 or 10 APIs that developers have to use just to operationalize or make reality AI within their applications.
Yeah, and I've spoken about this before, and I imagine that things have changed. I did boot camp in 2018, so it's entirely possible that things have improved, but they really didn't teach us as data scientists a lot about. They taught us how to build an API because we needed to be able to do that, to do a lot of the models that we were building, but they never really went over like code injection. It was kind of a side note. And so I turned in my first anomaly detection algorithm for the sim that I worked for, and my CEO was like, code injection, code. Like, what are you building? I was like, I don't know. Like, it's not really my department, right?
Wow.
Yeah, and so and right alongside this, there are exploitation of microservices. So this is kind of the same thing, that these microservices are built for internal application to help, typically to help the company serve its own internal customers and maybe partners. And so what we're seeing is that these things can oftentimes be not as secure as they should be. And criminals know this, and criminals know things like, well, if it's a retail target, they probably are going to be struggling to monitor their microservices during Black Friday, right? So, the unfortunate thing about criminals is that they're smart.
Yeah. And they can also be lazy, right? So this could simply be authentication issues, or maybe a little more complex authorization issues. Right, so that's even trickier yet, but certainly, that's all embedded in the microservices, and there needs to be some kind of consistency, dev plan behind the scenes that makes sense of that.
Yeah, and then I think a couple of these things kind of go hand in hand. I'm going to throw the rest of them up here. So data leaks and machine learning model attacks that kind of can be one and the same, right? So we've seen some of the largest tech organizations in the world accidentally do things like post full machine backups to a Git repo where they're trying to post an AI model. And a lot of times these data leaks that happen are a result of not knowing that specific type of data was even accessible by these different APIs and microservices that we're talking about. So I think this is also something that's going to be quite a bit more problematic. We've also seen, as OpenAI and some of the other LLM providers have gotten better at enforcing their license limits, we've also seen a lot of attackers crawling the web looking for open generative AI proxies, basically. So, corporations that are messing around with AI services and building their own internal AI services, but have forgotten to do good authentication on the back end. So we're seeing some of that, and that attackers are exploiting unsecured APIs to gain access to extra license for AI.
Yeah, and on the DDoS side of the house, most of these vendors for mature APIs, mature products, they have most of the stuff either built into DevOps, or they're front-ending this work with an API gateway, which should handle most of this. And we here at Cribl do a lot of that as well. So we know that there are standards that are set around rate limiting. I think Jackie and I talked about circuit breaking earlier on, but it's fairly standard to be able to look for specific HTTP retry codes that gently nudge the end user that, hey, you're coming at me just a little bit too quick. We'll send you an HTTP recode try. And then there are some standards around how many times you retry and what that time limit looks like. So those are out there, but again, it's the unexpected one API that you're looking for, right? It's always the anomalous thing out there that causes the biggest problems. So it's tough to catch them all. And when you're talking about hundreds or thousands of APIs, around one enterprise app, let's say, it's likely that one little thing will slip through the cracks.
Yeah, and that's where this monitoring and logging comes in, right? But if you're accurately monitoring and logging and collecting all the data you want to, you could find yourself. And by the way, I used generative AI to make all of these photos, and I asked it for a picture of a goat drowning in a sea of data. This is what I got.
Like candy, like data is candy. That's awesome.
Yeah, it does kind of look like High Chews or Starburst, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now and Laters. Those are my favorite. So this is crazy. This year, data volumes from APIs will literally double. And this is due to a large number of things, right? Increasing cloud adoption, increasing use of microservices. AI in general will drive a insane amount of API volume just because that is the way most large enterprises are choosing to interact with large language models. So that alone is crazy. But what we're seeing is that where organizations are really kind of failing before they even start, because if you don't start with establishing and maintaining data quality standards, you basically will spend the next several years fighting fires associated with data quality standards. So trying to figure out why your large language model just spit out somebody's social security number or a session token and things like that, right? And so large language models and generative AI generally is only as good as your ability to categorize and identify the data before it's fed into them. So I think this will continue to be a massive problem. And then I talk about this a lot. But the other thing is that there's this thing called model collapse that happens when generative AI accidentally trains on something that it generated. It's kind of like a snake eating its own tail. And that model will just become dumber and dumber until it stops working completely. So we're also going to need to start really tightly controlling. And this is another place where, again, people are just kind of copying and pasting stuff out of a browser window from ChatGPT and Gemini and places like that. And so we're really not tagging this data as, hey, this was generated by generative AI. It should never be fed into a generative AI model. So that is something else that we're really going to have to start looking at. Comments? Criticisms? Disagreements?
Good topic. I mean, in the face of data deluge, right? I mean, at the end of the day, somebody has to be strategic as we think about this. And at the top of that list are things like zero trust and API gateways. Certainly, DevSecOps is fair game for this. And we haven't really talked about it, but it's near and dear to our heart, right? It's the repeatable kind of centralized approach for all logging with all these ephemeral services scattered around everywhere. So it's true to our mission. It's making absolutely certain that we've got one centralized location for all of these logs to go to. Then it's up to the customer based on the use case to decide what that data looks like, where that data goes. Like put the right data in the right location for the right reason. Right. So again, that's maybe a tertiary line of defense, but still it is defense in depth, and it deserves it.
Yeah, and that's what just from what Jim's saying. That I think AI and LLMs are the only way to make sense and get value from the data. But as Jackie was saying, the data has to be detailed, it has to be standardized, it has to be high quality. And that's why I think DevSecOps is so important, to set that foundation for that data and make sure that it's consistent. Because as you mentioned, all it takes is one API that was developed by some side team as a side project that was done some other way, and it just creates a huge problem.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I found really compelling about Cribl when I was initially introduced to the company, was this concept of kind of advanced parsing and filtering of logs. And that, if you're just parsing your logs with like a regex or something like that, that breaks. And when it breaks, a lot of times you lose data. You just stop collecting it, or something spins out of control, or you end up running up a massive bill. Cribl kind of gives you the ability to say, hey, this is the order of operations for parsing. And every time something breaks, you always have the option to just keep collecting the raw data, right? And so that to me is something that needs to be a focus. And we have to, not only do we have to get parsing right, but if we get it wrong or it breaks and we can't get it right, we need to have a pretty foolproof way to not just lose that data. Because that's another thing that we're seeing.
I mean, that last point, even beyond that last point I made around defense and depth, one of the things that comes to mind certainly is, shared keys get compromised somewhere by phishing or posted out there on a bucket somewhere, right? That begs the question, maybe it's like a fourth line of defense, like, what are you doing, right? So this is, I think Jackie's point earlier around ML, right? It's not really a weakness in the code. This is more of maybe a data exfil kind of thing, or it's the presence of PII data, right? So again, from that monitoring perspective in ML, you've got clustering and anomaly detection, all kinds of interesting things behind the scenes that have to happen. So again, that really does kind of bring to point that it's a legitimate angle that does happen in the wild, and it's no real fault of the developers. It's just misuse of the application.
That's why guardrails and standards are so important.
And it really is the keys to the kingdom, right? With some of these big giant breaches over the last 2 years, many of them were from.
Speaking of the keys to the kingdom,
there you go.
Let's talk about cloud and access and auth and IoT logs. Like, this is the literal keys to the kingdom, right? But also network logs. And we've talked about this a lot, so we maybe don't need to kill this subject, but really to be able to detect some of these things, some of these exploits, especially third-party threats, which are becoming increasingly concerning. You have the Okta support breach and things like that. You really need to be collecting verbose logs, but they are crazy bulky. And historically with object storage, there's not really a great way to have your cake and eat it too, and both park something somewhere that's low cost, but also have it be highly available to search and parse and potentially rerun through some type of analytics platform if you really need it. So this is just another example in the long list of things to keep you up at night of API logs that we need to be looking at.
Well, incident response, right? And that's the big one. Something's wrong. We don't know what it is or how it happened. The IR folks are going to depend on those kinds of logs after the fact. So even though they're maybe not operationalized day to day, right? Absolutely key in figuring out who did what and what's the scope of the blast.
It's a nightmare scenario, especially third party. You've been there, Jim. You're doing an IR and you find out the problem's a third party API that you don't have control over, and so you're trying to get someone on the phone who doesn't work for you, who doesn't know who you are, to say, hey, you need to turn that off, and it's just it just creates a real systemic risk.
Yeah. All right. So now we get to the good stuff. And I am not the experts, so. And Jim, what would you, if you had to pick 2 or 3 things that are top tier, what would you do today? The table stakes for using APIs and microservices effectively. What would you say?
I would
Sure, Jim.
Hit the pause button and be as strategic as you can. I think that risk mitigation is possible if you put some quality thought in this and just take a look at what most folks are doing around best practices. I think I mentioned this earlier. It's API gateway. It's DevSecOps. I think centralized logging is extremely important to what we're after here. Pay attention to cloud and a lot of the value that can be derived, from these API logs, and don't shy away from the fact that we are going to be using more and more third-party SaaS solutions to help close these visibility gaps, and you need mechanisms to make absolutely certain that you understand what those third-party risks are. And oftentimes you can get at that data. And again, we see it day to day with our partnerships that we have out there. Even though it's a SaaS portal and they're doing something extremely well on your behalf and they provide a console into that, oftentimes, again, from retention, compliancy, IR perspective, you need to get those logs out of that portal back into something that you can control and protect, long term. So that may be one thing that I think is maybe often overlooked, but that stuff is generally easy to get to. Again, it's just quality thought and being prepared.
You got to start from the top and start from the bottom. So when you're at the top, you have to have a strategy in place. You have to make sure you have a systemic program in place that's looking for, do we know what all of our APIs are? Do we know what all our SaaS providers are? And actively have programs where you're requiring people to tell you that they're there, but also that you're looking for it. And then from the bottom, it defense in depth. It's classic of make sure that your APIs are released secure by default, that there's the same type of logging, the same type of information, that you're using your data lake and you're using your data management, and operations and security in order to manage the appropriate logging. and that you're constantly looking at, are we doing what are we supposed to be doing and taking corrective action? Because and it's not if something happens, it's when. You have to know that, here are the basics, here are the fundamentals, here are the things we have to have in place, because your IR is going to be hard enough as it is. You don't need a bunch of variables in place to make it worse.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'll put one more to the end of yours there is, as you're being proactive and you're grabbing this data, you having spent time in like the anti-money laundering, the anti-fraud space, there is one notion that holds true. And it's the fraudster or the threat actor is always the anomalous actor, right? They're always doing something a little bit different than the crowd, right? So it's easy to say that, right? So how do you detect that, right? It's junior league work to detect much of this stuff, but what is not, considered to be junior league is coming face to face with reality that you need all of that data. At the end of the day, you need to be best situated relative to your data, and that's a piece that maybe is not so easy to get to. But if you can come to grips and be realistic about that, and I've seen this hundreds of times get played out again and again and again. Breach happens, customer does the right thing, they notify, they bring in the experts, and the first thing the experts have to do is they have to go get all of that data, bring that data together, piece that data together. The story is always in the data, right? Your data is screaming at you. It's trying to tell you a story. So at a minimum, get that data in one location. Then as a bonus, do some normalization of that data. Then you're in a much better place in terms of being situated relative to your reality.
But I was saying you can make that process much easier by having standardized data, standardized catalog, standardized aggregation points. If you've been there for an IR, when you have to go find the data, you have to understand the data, you have to understand the gaps in the data. It just takes forever.
Yep.
Yeah.
Be
All
smart.
right.
Plan, strategy.
Yep. Plan to fail, right?
Exactly.
If you fail to plan, you'll plan to fail. Yeah.
We got to do the next one on cyber resilience. So thank you, Jackie, for bringing that up.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much. I always learn a ridiculous amount when I listen to you talk. It's always a pleasure to co-host anything with you guys.
Hey, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, and for our audience, really appreciate y'all being here. To check out the Cribl community at cribl.io/community. Sign up for our Slack channel, but a little over 6,000 strong now. Also, we have Cribl sandboxes where you can check out the Cribl tooling. 15-minute commitment. You'll know whether Cribl tools are for you or not. And we really appreciate everyone's time, and we hope to see you in the community. And have a great day.